I have spent 22 years proving that the extraordinary is, almost without exception, explainable. When I began as a psychiatric coroner, fresh from my fellowship in neuropathology, I was warned that mental hospitals collect stories the way sea wrecks collect barnacles. Former orderlies would whisper about voices in sealed wards, or bodies that twitched long after death. I built my reputation dismantling those tales. Electrolyte imbalance could mimic possession. Post-mortem gas could make a corpse sit up. I catalogued these explanations in precise, ink-dark lines across thousands of handwritten case logs. Each morning I prepare my workspace the same way. I brew a cup of strong, almost medicinal coffee, set out scalpels in a strict left-to-right order, and open the battered Leica camera I use to photograph the brain. Routine keeps the irrational at bay. I am not a believer. I am a technician of endings. My work centers on the brain after death. Most people assume a coroner simply finds cause, stroke, overdose, trauma, and writes it down. Psychiatric forensics is narrower. I study the neural storms left in the wake of long mental illness, the scars of electroconvulsive therapy, the cellular collapse from decades of antipsychotics. Occasionally, when time of death is uncertain, I run an electroencephalogram, an EEG. In life, an EEG is a set of electrodes that listen to a brain's electricity, the way a stethoscope listens to a heart. In death, the graph should be flat, a line so quiet it feels like snow falling on radio static. That silence is comforting. It tells me the hurricane of thought has finally blown itself out. I've long told students, brains die cleanly. Madness stops with the heart. When families ask whether their loved ones suffered in the end, I assure them the brain's last activity is brief and chaotic. No lingering nightmare. The Melbourne asylum where I often work used to be state-of-the-art. Bluestone halls, barred windows, lecture theatres for young doctors. Scandals shut it down decades ago, but a few sub-basements remain in use as overflow morgue and EEG lab. It's quiet there. Peeling paint, rusted rails, an old ventilation system that hums like a tired organ. My kind of place, sterile, forgotten, free of myth. Or so I believed, because once, in that silent wing, a case came across my table that refused to stay quiet. A single patient who, even in death, would not let go of the storms in his mind. That night still hums in me like a power line, and it began with the body of a man named Simon Keene. Simon Keene arrived, the way the forgotten always do, in a zipped black bag that smelled faintly of institutional soap and the breath of old plastic. The gurney wheels scuffed the bluestone as the orderlies maneuvered him into the basement wing. His chart rode on top, thin and overhandled, its corners feathered by decades of indifferent fingers. Keene, Simon, I read aloud, because reading aloud fixes attention. Male, 61, long-term inpatient, catatonic, onset in late adolescence, 34 years institutionalized, cause of death, presumed cardiac arrest during evening checks, time of death, uncertain. Maeve Tran arrived behind the gurney, quick-footed, ponytail damp from the drizzle above ground, cheeks bright with the cold. "I brought the modern toys," she said, lifting a hard case that held a portable EEG amplifier and fresh disposable electrodes. Maeve is a good antidote to the basement's age. She believes in software updates, crisp baselines, and the joy of proving haunted stories mathematically dull. "We'll do it by the book," I told her. "The book is thin. Confirm identity, confirm death, document, preserve." Simon's face, when I unzipped the bag, had the lax serenity of someone who has not had the authority to make his own expressions for half a lifetime. I noted an old ECT scar pattern in the temporal regions, little pale crescents where electrodes had bitten again and again. His pupils were fixed and dilated, corneal reflex absent, jaw slack. The chest under the sheet held still with a stubbornness only the dead can manage. ECG, a straight, unbroken line as expected. The basement wing held itself in its usual uneasy hush. Fluorescent light stuttered with a minute delay before settling. The air moved in the slow draft of disused places. A current you only notice because it touches the hairs on your wrist. Water somewhere distant, counting time in drops. The broken intercom at the far end sparked a soft static once, then reconsidered sound. I explained to Maeve, and to myself, because repetition is a form of armour, that our EEG pass would be archival. Post-mortem EEG is a courtesy to ambiguity, I said, a way to mark that there was no ambiguity. I placed the electrodes methodically, frontal, central, temporal, occipital. To anyone outside our trade, electroencephalography sounds arcane. In truth, it is a set of microphones for the scalp, listening for electricity. A living brain makes a quiet choir of rhythm. A dead brain does not sing. Conductive gel. Gentle pressure. I wiped a smear from my glove and clicked the amplifier leads into place. Maeve watched the screen. The trace began, a neat procession of machine calm, a flatness that, in my line, is mercy. Then a tooth rose in the line. Artifact, Maeve said immediately. The correct reflex. Artifact is the catch-all for false positives. Cable jiggle, skin potential, the petulance of electronics. She tapped the ground lead, checked impedances. Everything read within range. The display smoothed. Then another crest, small. Then a second, sharper, as if an invisible hand had learned the motion. I felt my throat tighten and refused to name the feeling. Check your reference, I said. She switched to a different reference, recalibrated the filter. The wavelets persisted, falling into a tempo. Theta edging into beta in brief runs. Theta is the brain's idle hum. Beta is attention. In a cadaver, both should be myth. I narrated my own countermeasures for the record. Securing leads, dampening external lines, reconfirming asystole. The ECG remained a mute horizon. The skin temperature under my fingers was the indifferent chill of a plinth. Yet the EEG's rhythm gathered itself. Small coherent bursts marching across channels in a way randomness does not manage. In the corner of the screen, a synchrony metric ticked upward in patient, guiltless digits. Maeve's confidence wavered by degrees, not all at once. Could be mains interference, she tried. The building's electricity is a dirty river. We both know that. She rotated the notch filter. The pattern dipped, sidestepped, and returned, as if the interference had listened to our move and made a counter-move. Organized applause from an empty stadium, I heard myself say, low enough the recorder would catch it, but not judge me for metaphor. The analogy fit too well. Something coordinated, with no one there to coordinate. We started over, the way you do when your worldview needs a second pass. New electrodes, fresh gel, a different amplifier. We positioned the gurney away from the junction box where the fluorescent tubes buzzed. I cut all unneeded equipment power, leaving only the amplifier, the display, and the clock. We stood very still, because stillness simplifies. The bursts came back exactly on the 7th second after baseline began, as if they had been waiting for the ritual to finish. I felt the precise moment my training and my superstition reached for the same explanation, and found none. The most honest thing in that room was the math, the most terrifying too, though I would not allow that word space in my notes. I want 10 minutes of continuous recording, I said, careful to sound like policy. Then we repeat. If we can reproduce this, we'll escalate. Maeve nodded, the motion small, eyes narrowed in the way people look through problems rather than at them. While the trace unspooled, I catalogued Simon's body in the clinical language that has always kept me safe. Lividity fixed, rigor diminishing, no trauma consistent with foul play. I photographed with the Leica, the shutter's clap absurdly loud in the wing. 10 minutes extended itself like a hallway in a bad dream. The bursts rose and fell, found each other across channels, drifted apart, and then, impossibly, synchronized again. The way two pendulums on the same shelf begin unknowingly to share a heartbeat. We saved the file to 2 drives. We wrote the time in our logs. I initialed the entry, my pen digging a little too hard into the page. Again, I said. Because if there is one doctrine I have never abandoned, it is this. What happens once can be an error. What happens twice is data, and data obliges you to peel back the next layer. The first rule of a baffling case is simple: verify the record before you trust the body. I began the morning by sitting at the narrow metal desk beside Simon Keene's gurney and opening his chart. It was so thin for a life so long that I felt a flicker of unease before I'd read a word. 34 years of catatonia had been boiled down to a few stapled pages. Admission notes from the 1980s, a faded consent for electroconvulsive therapy, dosage changes for haloperidol and clozapine scribbled by different hands. Someone had typed a single line decades ago. Persistent unresponsive state, non-verbal, immobile, no observed voluntary movement. Then silence for years. I paused to explain the term for the audio recorder. Catatonia is not sleep. It's a state where the body is awake, but the will is absent. The muscles hold postures, the eyes open but unseeing, as though the self has slipped behind a locked door. Patients can linger there for months, even years. Simon had lingered for decades. His brain, by all accepted models, should have been long quiet now. Maeve hovered behind me, sipping instant coffee from a paper cup, peering over my shoulder. "It's like no one thought he'd ever die," she said. "No updates after 96. "We'll give him better notes in death than he had in life," I replied. It's a small oath coroners make when the living have failed someone. Imaging the silent brain, we began with the standard post-mortem imaging. The gross anatomy was unremarkable. Age-shrunken gyri, some ventricular enlargement. But when we moved to high-resolution slices, my screen filled with strange geometry. Micro-scarring curling into spiral traces along the medial temporal lobe. Patterns unlike any I had catalogued. Usually, scarring after decades of ECT and catatonia looks like islands or patches. This was deliberate, almost drawn. Maeve leaned closer to the monitor. "Artifact?" I shook my head slowly. "No surgical hardware. No vascular cause. It's patterned." I traced the spiral with a gloved finger on the glass. To anyone outside our field, imagine tree rings, but burned into grey matter by some long, rhythmic storm. Measuring the invisible Maeve unpacked her modern magnetoencephalography scanner, a sensitive device that listens not to electricity, but to the faint magnetic fields that neural firing makes. I told the recorder, "Meg is like holding a compass next to thought. If neurons spark, the needle wavers. It should have wavered not at all. Yet as soon as we calibrated, the field strength spiked around the corpse. The machine hummed in a way it rarely does outside a live subject." Maeve's brows furrowed. "It's 3 orders above baseline, and he's colder than the room." The fluorescent tubes overhead flickered. Not the lazy flutter of old bulbs, but crisp, timed to the bursts we were seeing. I felt a buzz against my wrist. My stainless watch was vibrating faintly, as if pulled by an invisible pulse. The first disturbance. That was when I heard it. A child crying, very faint, somewhere behind the old therapy room doors. I froze, certain it was a trick of the air ducts. "Did you—" I began. Maeve didn't look up from the display. "What? You didn't hear?" I stopped. Best not to plant ideas. She noticed my hesitation, smirked. "Basement ambience. Pipes do that. I logged it anyway. Unverified auditory perception. Possible pareidolia. It's what we call the brain's habit of finding signal in noise, like faces in clouds or voices in running water." Still, my gut tightened. For 22 years I had walked into rooms filled with grief and folklore and left with clear, clean, cause of death notes. That clarity wavered for the first time. The reluctant log-eye forced myself back into method. I measured, photographed, noted each anomaly with clinical neutrality. Coherent post-mortem field, magnetics elevated, spiral gliosis patterning. My pen scratched steadily, though my fingers wanted to tremble. Maeve was still chasing rationality, layering notch filters, moving sensors. "Old building wiring," she muttered. "Maybe the Meg's picking up elevator motors." "There's one elevator," I reminded her. "It hasn't moved since we came down." She stopped then, just briefly. and in the glow of the monitor I saw her youth yield a sliver to unease. I closed the chart. Document everything. Don't interpret yet. Not until we're sure. But some part of me already knew we were leaving the safe ground of protocols. The numbers were too ordered, the disturbances too precisely timed. For the first time in my career, I wrote a phrase I'd never written before. Coherent post-mortem field. Verification pending. My own handwriting looked foreign under the fluorescence, and though I didn't say it aloud, the question formed, heavy as the cold air. What happens if the storm isn't over? The EEG monitor answered with a slow, deliberate pulse, like a machine breathing when it shouldn't. And in that hush, I realized the next step would require staying through the night. That decision, to keep vigil, would lead me somewhere no autopsy should go. I told myself the overnight watch was only good protocol. If a signal persists across cycles, power on, power off, day into night, it deserves to be logged. That's what I wrote in my notes before Maeve left for the evening. But when the elevator doors closed behind her, their rattle fading up the shaft, the basement seemed to inhale and hold its breath. I made camp in the EEG room. The corpse lay on the steel plinth, pale beneath the loose sheet. The old fluorescent tubes hummed in uneven intervals, and the ventilation system coughed now and then, pushing a cold draft that touched the back of my neck like a wet finger. I kept lights low to avoid electrical interference. The screen glowed green and white, a city of lines across black. Hours slid by in the stillness. I read the trace, checked impedances, drank bitter thermos coffee. The rhythm persisted. Faint theta spindles then, impossibly organized beta bursts that aligned with each sweep of the second hand. Dead brains do not pace clocks. I whispered the fact aloud once, as though speaking it could anchor reality. No action potentials after death. No synchrony without metabolism. Somewhere near 3 a.m., the corridor beyond the lab shifted. Not physically, perspective. It lengthened the way a dream hallway does, angles subtly off, vanishing point tugged farther away. I blinked hard, blaming fatigue. But the geometry stayed wrong until I looked back to the corpse. Then the EEG did something new. Its waves slipped in and out of my own alpha rhythm, the idle pulse of a conscious brain at rest. I know mine well. After 2 decades, you internalize the shape of your own quiet. This was it, appearing on the cadaver's channels. A technical impossibility. No heart, no blood flow, yet mirroring me. I felt a tug, light at first, like when a train beside yours begins to move and you doubt which one is moving. Quick flashes followed. A tiled ward, light too white to be gentle, leather straps dark with age, water and hands forcing a head under, not memory, his memory, Simon's. I ripped one glove half off and checked my pulse, fast but present. My field notes record this with understatement. Observer experienced brief intrusive visual phenomena, probable sleep deprivation. I knew better. The elevator clanged open before dawn. Maeve returned with a brisk knock of her boots on bluestone and an energy drink in hand. She found me pale, still logging. You look like you met a ghost, she teased. Not a ghost. My voice sounded foreign. Something worse. Coupling. She frowned, set down her bag. Coupling? Think of 2 metronomes on the same shelf, I explained, steadying myself by the familiar act of teaching. They start swinging together, our brains, and his. Maeve rolled her eyes lightly, but with less confidence than usual. Maybe your metronome just needs sleep. Still, she checked the equipment, reattached leads, ran a control test. The bursts matched my resting rhythm again, even after she replaced the entire amplifier. We decided on a barrier test. I dragged an old Faraday cage, a mesh chamber meant to block electromagnetic fields, from storage. We set the corpse inside, cables feeding through filters. In theory, this should isolate anything radiating outward. When the system rebooted, the waves slipped back onto the screen within minutes, patient and inexorable. Stronger now, more coherent. My recorder caught me muttering, "Field bypassed shielding." Then the hallucinations intensified. Voices whispered from the dark corners of the wing. Not screams, but recitations, patient names. Some I'd signed off on years ago. The sound came without direction, as though the air itself were remembering. Maeve froze mid-keystroke. "You heard that?" I said. She nodded once, sharp. Colour drained from her face. And the doors. Down the hall, a heavy isolation door eased itself shut. No draft, no pressure change. Just a slow, deliberate click. She laughed nervously. The dry laugh of someone whose skepticism just lost a tooth. Building settling. I didn't correct her, though every engineer's report I'd read said those hinges haven't moved in decades. Meanwhile, the data worsened. Ambient EM sensors, nothing to do with scalp electrodes, began registering the pattern across the entire wing, pulsing in perfect tandem with the corpse's trace. And under the clinical part of me, something cracked. For years I'd taught that death is the clean severance of illness, that brains are radios you can finally switch off. Now the dead one was broadcasting, and I was its aerial. I signed a new line in the log with a shaking hand. Persistent post-mortem field, spreading beyond containment. Maeve whispered, "We should leave." But I only looked at the rising synchrony metric and felt, for the first time, a professional doctrine collapse. If death does not silence madness, I thought, what else have I been wrong about? The lights flickered once, in time with the corpse. And somewhere deep in the old asylum, a low hum answered, inviting us further in. The decision to stay was at first a gesture of discipline. We needed a complete record. That's what I told Maeve as we prepared for another cycle of monitoring. But as midnight deepened and the asylum's upper floors sank into total silence, discipline began to feel like a thin excuse for curiosity. We shut down every unnecessary circuit to limit interference. Only the EEG, the MEG, and a single emergency lamp stayed on. The rest of the wing fell into shadow. Our breath smoked faintly. The old ventilation coughed once and went still. The fluorescent tubes overhead dimmed to a grey suggestion of light, then failed entirely with a brittle pop. Emergency lighting came alive. Red bars of glow along the floor and exit signs, turning every surface into a surgical theatre soaked in blood. The hum I had felt for hours became audible, a low note that seemed to rise from the stone walls themselves. The corpse lay at the room's centre, pale and dry, electrodes glittering like insects on its scalp. Maeve murmured, "Power cut?" "Backups are on," I said, though I had no idea if that was true. The machines hadn't so much as flickered. They pulsed steadily, their screens the only moving light, jagged white lines that were no longer random. They had organized into stacked, synchronous bursts. I tried to narrate for the recorder. Persistent field, amplitude increasing. My voice cracked mid-sentence. Then the hum turned into sound, not through speakers, in the air itself. Footsteps echoing down the corridor, dozens of them, measured and out of sync with our own. We both spun to face the door, but saw only empty hall washed in red. The hallucination began with smell. Disinfectant cut with damp wool and singed hair. The distinctive odour of early electroconvulsive therapy. Then the corridor shifted again, lengthening, filling with beds on iron wheels, straps hanging loose. The gurney under Simon seemed suddenly not ours but theirs, decades old and stained. Maeve swore softly. "I'm seeing—" "I know," I said. Time split. We stood in our present, but also in Simon's remembered ward. Nurses with blurred faces, shock machines spitting arcs of pale blue light, patients screaming without sound. The field didn't just show, it placed us. My hands were gloved but slick with sweat. The Leica swung against my hip, useless. I understood then what the data had been building toward. The corpse was using us as hardware. Simon's dead neurons, arranged in those spiral scars, were pushing a final broadcast. Our living tissue was the amplifier. Maeve stumbled toward the EEG console. "We kill the signal or shut it down." She flipped power off. The machines restarted themselves. No relay click, no boot sequence, just instant life, as if the field had become their power source. "That's not possible," I whispered. "Circuits don't self-drive." Another wave hit. Identity distortion. I looked at the staff in Simon's memory and saw my own face among them. Mask, gloves, delivering shock. It made no chronological sense, but forced me to feel complicity. My stomach clenched. For an instant, I couldn't remember which reality was mine. I fought back with procedure, grounding technique. I touched the cold steel table, named what I felt. Smooth, wet with condensation. Real, counted 6 slow breaths. The hallucination adapted. The table's texture crawled, softening to leather straps beneath my palms. Maeve screamed then. A clipped sound. Not fear, but raw disorientation. She was staring at the exit, which had folded impossibly inward. The hallway now looped back on itself, the same red exit sign behind and ahead. Perceptual recursion, the field closing the maze. "We have to get out," she gasped. "If we leave, no one will believe this," I said, shocked at my own stubbornness. After decades of debunking, some desperate part of me wanted proof. "We need a final trace. Isabelle, help me keep the record alive." Together we moved like sleepwalkers back to the console. The EEG graph had become a single, elegant waveform. Simon's silent scream encoded as pattern. I hit record. The corpse shuddered once. Not muscle twitch, but a slow, total shift, as though some internal tide moved. His mouth sagged open. Inside was no throat, only static. Not visible, but somehow perceived. A white hiss that pressed into thought rather than ears. I said aloud, shaking, "Dead neurons don't synchronize. This is a burnt-out radio broadcasting a play." I needed the words logged. If nothing else, future readers would know I understood the impossibility. Maeve clutched my arm. Tears streaked her cheeks. "It's in my head," she said. "It knows I don't believe it." And the vision surged one final time. Not images now, but memories rewriting themselves. My morning coffee ritual, my calm lecture halls, infected with asylum light and straps. It was showing me that death had not erased Simon's madness. It had preserved it, hungry for witnesses. Then, silence. Not gradual, absolute. The monitors fell flatline. Emergency lights blinked back to normal white. My watch stopped vibrating. The air was only air again. We stood sweating in the sudden ordinariness. Machines humming on battery. Corpse unchanged. Maeve dropped into a chair, shaking, whispering, "It's over." I stared at the waveform still frozen on the screen. Perfect, coherent, impossible. It only needed to be heard, I said. My voice was ragged but sure. For the first time in 22 years, I felt my entire professional creed collapse. The belief that death ends madness. Somewhere above us, the elevator whined to life on its own, and in that rising hum, I sensed the story was not finished, only paused, waiting for what we would do next. When daylight finally touched the stairwell windows, I felt as if we had survived an airless night at sea. Maeve rode the elevator first, silent, eyes red but dry. I lingered to pack the evidence, the drives with our recordings, the printed EEG traces, my handwritten notes. My fingers shook as I zipped the black bag back over Simon Keene's face. I had done this for thousands of dead, always with a quiet sense of finality. This time it felt like pulling a thin veil over a machine that might still be running. I kept my voice clinical for the recorder. Autopsy complete. Cause of death: cardiac arrest. Long-term psychiatric comorbidity. EG artifact unverified. I said the lie as if reading a lab value. Because the truth, that a brain can persist and broadcast after death, would not survive the politics of pathology. No peer-reviewed journal would print it. No medical board would endorse it. And if I put it plainly, I would be asked to surrender my license for evaluation. Maeve met me upstairs in the changing room. Her hands were scrubbed raw. "We're not writing what we saw." "We're writing what can be believed," I said. My tone was flat, but inside something crumbled. She looked at me for a long moment, then nodded once. Not agreement, just survival. She left before I could add anything. The official report I filed that week was immaculate. Post-mortem EEG artifact, likely due to residual electrical interference and old wiring. No abnormality requiring further inquiry. The spiral scarring in Simon's brain became non-specific gliosis. My explanation for colleagues was brisk. Old asylum labs produce beautiful false positives. They smiled, relieved that the world was still ordinary. However, kept a private archive, the raw EEG data, the photos, the magnetics logs. I hid the drives behind autopsy texts in my office. When I looked at the waveform, still perfect and synchronized, I felt a pressure in the room, as though someone was reading over my shoulder. Maeve lasted 3 more weeks in the rotation. Then an email arrived. "Dr. Firth, I'm resigning my slot. I can't sleep. Every time I close my eyes, I'm back in that hall. Patients' names I don't know keep whispering." I didn't answer. There was nothing I could say that would mend the fracture between science and what we'd witnessed. By autumn, I stopped coming to the morgue. Colleagues assumed I was burned out. Perhaps I was. In truth, I could no longer slice into a brain believing that death ends its storms. I had taught residents for decades that mental illness dies with the body, that whatever haunted a patient could not reach beyond metabolism. Simon ended that certainty. I explain it simply now when former students ask why I retired early. If a dead brain can still trap the living in its nightmares, then death isn't an erasure. It's an echo that can infect you. That understanding sits heavier than any pathology case I've ever worked. Months later, unable to leave the wound alone, I drove back to the asylum. The upper floors had been reclaimed by dust and graffiti. In the stairwell, the air smelled of damp stone and old bleach. I descended to the psychiatric wing alone, flashlights sweeping across bluestone walls and flaking paint. The EEG room was as we'd left it. Empty plinth, silent machines stacked in the corner, cables coiled like sleeping snakes. I stood where Simon's body had lain and listened. Only the slow drip of water answered. Yet beneath the ordinary silence there was a pressure, faint but undeniable, the way air hums before a storm. I told myself it was memory, not physics. Still, I felt the hairs along my neck lift, the same way they had when the field first touched me. For a moment, I imagined turning the machines back on. I imagined the green trace rising again, patient, knowing. My hands hovered, but I forced them still. Some things should not be invited. I used to believe the dead are quiet. Simon proved me wrong. And sometimes, when the night hums just right, when the static between radio stations grows strangely ordered, I feel his dream reach for me again. That is why I no longer open skulls. I have learned that madness can outlive meat, and that once you have listened to it, you may never quite hear silence the same way again.